All right, I think we left off on Dred Scott, who is buried here in St. Louis. Just a little trivia crack knowledge for you. Dred Scott was a slave who sued his owner for his freedom when he traveled with his owner from a slave state into a free state. The Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen, and therefore he was property, so he could not sue. This is, again, one of the causes of the Civil War. This angers a lot of people. But the straw that breaks the camel's back, as I mentioned, is the election of Lincoln in 1860. So you will need to know that even though he's not on some of the Southern ballots, he wins the presidency anyway, and this angers a lot of Southerners. South Carolina is going to be the first to leave the Union and to secede. President Lincoln, the president of the Union, has some advantages in the Civil War. Some of the northern advantages are going to be economic. For example, the North has most of the industrial or manufacturing centers. They have the biggest cities, so they have a bigger population. They also have the most advanced railroad and transportation lines, and the best shipping connections. So they will not starve. They'll be able to ship supplies to and from. They have a lot of advantages that the South does not have. The South's biggest advantage, and there's Robert E. Lee, the South's biggest advantage is that they have heart. They're fighting for a cause. Whether you agree with it or not, they do. And that is their ability to leave the Union. They're fighting on their home turf, so they only have to defend their territory. They don't have to go on the offensive. And they have better military generals like Robert E. Lee, who was a Virginian. Robert E. Lee was asked to serve as the commander of the Union Army, but he turned it down, not because he necessarily believed in the cause, but he was more of a Virginian than an American. So they have better military generals. Remember, the military colleges are in the South. Here are a few just stats on the North and South. Again, one of their biggest advantages is that they're going to have Robert E. Lee. However, the North is going to win. Sorry to spoil that for you. One of the ways that they develop, one of the strategies that they develop that is very handy is the anaconda plan. If you recall, an anaconda snake strangles its prey before eating it. Sorry for that visual. The anaconda plan is going to look a lot like that. And if you look at this graphic here, it's the Union blockade of southern ports. They're going to cut off the Mississippi River so that the South can't trade with Europe and other nations. So that's going to basically start starving out the South. The Emancipation Proclamation, which is issued by President Lincoln on January 1st of 1863, grants freedom to slaves under the 13th Amendment. However, that is not necessarily the goal of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The goal is to end the war. By freeing the slaves, the cause of the Civil War is now not about keeping the Union together necessarily, but it's about slavery now. And because it's about slavery, you're going to see nations like Great Britain pull out their support for the South. So he does this to win the war. It's not necessarily a big moral compromise that he's making. Finally, Grant accepts General Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse, which is just a little bit of trivia for you, but you will find that on your exam. How on earth do you return to a sense of normalcy after a war like that? That's the big question with Reconstruction. Not only how do you accept the South back into the Union, but what do you do with the millions of freed slaves? Lincoln had the most lenient plan. His plan was called the 10% plan, in which he would allow only 10% of the South to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union, and then they would quickly be accepted back into the Union. That, again, was the most lenient plan. He fought very hard with the Republicans, who were a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more harsh towards the South. However, he is assassinated in 1865, and thus the leniency plan does not happen. During Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed. If you recall our march, I am free, I am a citizen, and I can vote. Unfortunately, this is a time of great violence and a lot of laws that keep African Americans from achieving full equality. Hint, hint, essay question. One of the ways that African Americans do not receive that extension of equality is by the Jim Crow laws that are put in place. Plessy versus Ferguson is the court case in 1896 that solidifies these laws. Homer Plessy sues the train car company that he's traveling on in Louisiana because they will not allow him to travel on the same car as many white people. He's actually 1/16 black, so he passes as a white man but is asked to leave the car. And the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal facilities are okay. Jim Crow laws restricted the civil rights of African Americans, even if they were legal with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Supreme Court mandated that separate facilities for black and white people were allowed as long as they were equal again. But we know from images that those were not actually equal facilities. Everything from bathrooms to libraries to morgues were segregated, and the services were just not the same. There were also voting restrictions placed to disenfranchise black voters. One would be a poll tax, another a literacy test, and finally a Klansman, maybe standing at the voting booth, keeping you from voting through intimidation. The Grandfather Clause was the only clause that kept poor white illiterate voters from having to resist voting or from being disenfranchised, because it stated that if your grandfather had not voted, then you could not vote either. So this is what allowed poor white illiterate people to vote. A lot of people fought for equality both in and out of the system, and when I say the system, I mean some people did it according to white rules. Booker T. Washington was one of those people. He believed that African Americans had to earn their rights and earn their equality by working hard and proving that they were just as capable as white people. Booker T. Washington began the Tuskegee Institute, and it was a friend to white people, mostly because he didn't ask for too much. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to challenge that rhetoric quite a bit. He and Booker T. Washington were really foes fighting for the same cause. He believed that African Americans had waited long enough for equality and that they deserved their rights immediately. He was classically trained at Harvard, and he believed that African Americans should have a classical education just like white people, and that they should demand their rights socially. The Great Migration is occurring at the same time that Booker T. and W.E.B. Du Bois are arguing about how best to end the Jim Crow laws. This is the movement of African Americans during World War I from the South to the North in search of jobs. Millions of people leave for the North, and many of them settle in communities like Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance is where we see a rebirth of African American culture that influences, whose influence spreads beyond Harlem. We have a lot of white and black people enjoying the music, the writings, the dances, and the culture of the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s. It's really a way that African Americans achieve cultural power, and it has a great influence on even the musicians and artists that many of you are listening to today. Brown versus Board of Education will be the case that overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, stating that separate facilities are not equal. Rosa Parks is going to fight for equality during the civil rights movement as an activist who is arrested and fined when she refuses to give up her seat on a bus. Her actions are going to spark the Montgomery bus boycott, where African Americans refused to ride the buses and protest segregation for well over a year. This boycott is led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and others, and we're going to see this nonviolent direct action, this nonviolent resistance be a very successful way for African Americans to achieve their rights during the 1960s. The Little Rock Nine will be another group of very silent and strong individuals who courageously decide to attend an all-white school. They are a group of African American students enrolled in Little Rock Central High School in 1957, and they are prevented from entering school by the National Guard. Again, very courageous young people. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is going to prevent discrimination of all kinds. This will officially end Jim Crow laws, and this is signed into law by President Johnson. The Voting Rights of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices, so the poll tax, literacy tests, and any sort of intimidation at the polls goes away at this time. We continue to see people fighting for equality. Malcolm X is a civil rights leader who is quoted as saying, "If they put their hands on you, put them into a cemetery." He was the African American leader of the civil rights movement who was much more aggressive than Martin Luther King. He was a member of the Brotherhood of Islam, and he took a more violent tactic to equality. We're going to see other achievements by African Americans. Obviously, we have our first African American president in office right now. You might want to pay attention to some of President Obama's earlier speeches in terms of his belief in equality and how far African Americans had come. Thurgood Marshall will be the first African American Supreme Court Justice, and so we're going to see a lot of achievements. But something to keep in mind is to what extent has the U.S. fulfilled its promise of equality to African Americans? And when you're answering that question, I want you even to consider what's going on today. Towards the end of our unit, we talked about the war on drugs. We talked about Ferguson. We watched Fruitvale Station. And I want you to take some of those themes and think about how you could answer that question more in depth. Another question, of course, to consider would be, have we fulfilled that promise of equality to Native Americans? So please use these reviews to help you answer those. Again, a couple of other maybe short answers that you want to look into and highlight. I would know the Emancipation Proclamation. I would know the Trail of Tears. And I would, if I were you, study up on Hoover and FDR. So please use these to inform your studies, and if you have any questions, you know where to find me.